Good morning from Sydney, Australia. Good morning from Sydney, Australia. My name is Asala Sayada and I'll be your host today. Before we begin, I would like to take this time to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the land which I'm tuning in from. I would like to pass on my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I would like to recognize their continuing connection to their land, waters, and culture. This land was and will always be the land of Aboriginal people. As I said, my name is Asala. I'm a social justice activist, a storyteller, and public speaker. By profession, I am also a social worker and a counsellor. I'm also the founder of Hawiyati. Hawiyati is a community project that explores the worldwide Palestinian identity and connects Palestinians in the diaspora. Welcome to this evening's webinar entitled Indigenous Intersectionality, Transnational Solidarity Against Settler Colonialism, hosted by the Palestinian Return Centre. The My Return campaign is a popular voluntary initiative launched by the London-based Palestinian Return Centre in cooperation with national and international pro-Palestine partners. The campaign was first launched in Jordan in cooperation with the Palestine Committee in the Jordanian Parliament. The campaign culminates in a petition that calls for and reaffirms the Palestinian right of return. The campaign seeks to turn such a basic right into an international cause. It seeks to garner the largest possible number of signatures on a petition confirming Palestinian refugees' devotion to their right of return. The petition clearly states that it rejects the US deal of the century, and any other initiative undermining Palestinians' internationally guaranteed rights. Israel and the US have never ceased to undermine such a basic Palestinian right by denying the refugees status of displaced Palestinians inside and outside the occupied Palestine. The former US President Donald Trump's recognition of occupied Jerusalem as Israel's capital, the campaign waged by Israel and the US against the United Nations Relief Agency, the US suspension of its funding to Palestinian refugees, and the increase in calls to resettle the refugees in destinations other than Palestine are tactics which, though seemingly divergent, aim for the same goal: undermining the right of return. The right of return will never be negotiated away or used as a bargaining chip. The campaign is based on individual signatures on My Return petition through its official website, www.myreturn.net. The petition has already garnered over 600,000 plus signatures. Please do sign now. Before we introduce our amazing speakers, if you do have any questions you would like our speakers to answer, please do leave them in the comments section and the speakers will answer them in the Q&A at the end. Now, let me introduce our first speaker, Alicia Jane. Alicia Jane is currently a PhD candidate studying at Sydney University. Alicia is a First Nations woman from Australia who utilises social media to challenge the false narratives surrounding Aboriginal people who are enduring a contemporary genocide. Please welcome Alicia Jane.
Hello everyone, and a big good morning from here in Sydney. And I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on Darug land in Western Sydney. So I guess I'm going to kick off with some speaking points that I've created for today. And as I was introduced, I'm an Indigenous woman. My mother comes from Queensland in Australia, and my father comes from a state, New South Wales, but a place called Wilcannia, which is a small town along a very prominent river in Australia called the Darling River. And I guess this is the area or the point, and a bit of both of my lineages is the point where I'm going to be discussing today, and the connection that Indigenous people have to our lands and particularly water. I myself, like countless First Nations people in this country, have been dispossessed from our traditional lands. I originally grew up in a rural town, but as a result of systematic discrimination, prejudice, racism, again, marginalization and alienation within that rural town, my parents had to make the decision to move to a larger city, which is Sydney. But again, unfortunately, like a lot of Indigenous families, they were under a false guise or idea or notion that Sydney or fleeing our original lands would provide us with safety and security and better opportunities. But once you arrive here, you also realize that you're getting all of this prejudice, racism, stereotyping, and colonial violence, but it just looks very different. So I've been living in Sydney now for over 15 years, and to this day, I'm still learning ways to navigate the colonial regimes and treatment of First Nations people. Recently, or 4 years ago, I became a mother to a daughter, and I guess anyone that embarks on that journey can say that that is a life-changing experience. But unfortunately for me, it has opened my eyes to the institutionalized racism and prejudice within the healthcare field, and has again exposed me to great lengths of trauma and damaging control that the Australian government has over First Nations people. Now, this is really strongly connected to the notion of citizenship. So that was one thing that I wanted to talk about as well, is in Australia, as soon as you register your child, or firstly, you're forced to register your child. If you don't, there's very severe penalties. For example, you don't receive any of your benefits, but your child is also not eligible for Medicare, so they're unable to receive any healthcare, any Medicare things that are covered by that, such as immunization. So I was forced to put my child under this colonial regime, and she was forced to become an Australian citizen. If I did not, I was at risk of losing my child. If I did not adhere to these rules and regulations, my child would have no access to any social provisions. Now, I just want to make mention to that, this process has been normalized since the arrival of the British. This notion of us adhering to their requirements, their requests, and their desires has been something that has been violently, aggressively, and abusively forced on First Nations people. And like many impoverished collectives, unfortunately, our most vulnerable demographics are left with that burden and that responsibility, such as mothers who have recently given birth. And in my case, that was definitely the case. Now, again, connecting back to my child as well, I have recognized the contemporary genocide that I am currently embarking on, with the fact that I'm unable to live on country. I was unable to give birth on country in Australia, in my traditional lands. We do not have the capacity. Our hospital has no birthing unit. So this was the case for where my father is from in Wilcannia, but this is also the case for where my mother is from in Queensland, which is pretty much on the other side of the country. And this narrative is something that is consistent, that is spread throughout our country, where First Nations people are unable to access the most basic of healthcare provisions, such as giving birth on their traditional lands. Now, most of you tuning in, and I'm sure a lot of the other guests today will discuss and share their perspectives and opinions on the importance of connecting to country. And that's another point in my presentation I wanted to share, was the power of the welfare state, and even dictating where First Nation women are able, and when we're able, to give birth on our traditional lands. Genocide in the Australian context does not look like what we have been taught. Genocide in the Australian context is constantly changing, just like the welfare state is. And as a result of that, our perpetual disenfranchisement has become something that is happening behind closed doors, is something that is happening that is so insidious and is so greatly hidden in this country that loves to hide behind the guise of being a first world country or a developed country, when in actuality, First Nations people are living in third world conditions. Like I mentioned, with no access to clean water, we're constantly being forced to move and leave our communities. And then whilst we're in our communities, we're still forced to leave while we give birth or need to access further healthcare and or treatment. Also, I would like to acknowledge the Palestinian experience. I would also like to acknowledge other First Nations experience that are listening in and tuning in today. It is a tragedy, it is a travesty when myself as an Indigenous woman or an Aboriginal woman from Australia has to hear and witness what our other counterparts are expected to endure in relation to their own colonial welfare state. Because for me, it's almost like looking into the future. Australia has only been colonised for 233 something years. So we're a fairly recent colonial experience. We're a mere blink compared to other nation states. So when I see what the capacity of these welfare states are, such as what is happening within India right now in the farmers' protest, it gives me an eerie feeling like I'm almost somewhat looking into a crystal ball. My other insight would be is what is happening to us right now is very violent. It is very volatile. And our country loves to hide behind this sense of all the beauty of its nature, all of the things that it has to offer, but it will never acknowledge the deficit. It will never acknowledge the severe disadvantages in relation to mental health, substance abuse, education, and again, the most basic access to human rights. Now, please tell me if I'm blabbering on, guys, or if you have any questions, or if anyone wants to, chime in. I am a bit nervous, and this is my first time kind of jumping on board and getting involved with something like this. And I think that's the other thing is we are such a heavily persecuted population. Our prison statistics, the largest prison population that's growing in Australia right now is in fact Indigenous women. I live down the road from a large maximum security female prison. Now, this prison previously was a detention center, a youth detention center. So it just shows the necessity for the Australian government to keep creating these prisons, that they're willing to take and strip amazing resources from our youth, dig it out, cut it out and create and develop a supermax prison that was once in capacity of rehabilitating our youth. Now, again, me as an Indigenous woman and speaking on the importance of the recognition of a growing prison population within Australia, again, I'm sure, as you all know, the impacts of this is devastating on our people and our community. And again, this is a global trend. The things that are happening within relation to First Nations people within, I believe, any context can be applicable. But again, mentioning the limited time frames that are surrounding the colonial experience within Australia, it's really scary. I'm also a PhD candidate, so I'm writing a thesis on the Darling River and my people's connection, the Barkindji, to this waterway, and the ways that its destruction has resulted in the destruction of our very identity, our ways of being, our lives, and most importantly, our future prospects. Through even conducting this research, constantly tracking, constantly trying to stay on top of policy is impossible. I could literally sit at my computer for 2 days straight and be unable to strategically track what is happening in relation to water management or mismanagement within the colonial experience in Australia. And I believe this would be the case for countless other demographics that pertain to First Nation people. So if we're looking at policy around what we call over here family and community services, so FACS, if we're looking at what was previously referred to as docks in Australia, if we're looking at imprisonment, if we're looking at access to land, if we're looking at legal representation, whatever it is, this country is so swift and it is so mobile and it moves so fast in relation to really changing policy and not enabling citizens to track that. And from what I've learned from looking around the globe, again, this is yet again another global trend and strategy that has been utilized to further marginalize, dispossess, and disconnect First Nation people from what is happening around them. Do you guys have any questions, or do I keep talking?
We will actually wait until the end for the Q&A.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome
for this insightful talk, and it takes a lot of courage to speak about your personal experience. So thank you so much.
You're so welcome. Thank you for listening.
I will now introduce our second speaker, Rebecca Miles. Rebecca Miles is a citizen of the Nez Perce tribe, which is a federally recognized tribe and has a treaty between the two nations. Rebecca became the chairwoman of her tribe in 2005, the very first woman in the history of the tribe. She has worked extensively on social and environmental justice issues, including fighting for the fishing rights of her people. She currently resides on the Nez Perce Reservation, where she grew up in Lapwai, Idaho. Please welcome Rebecca Miles.
Thank you, Asala. Can you hear me okay? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. I will just make a few phrases in my own language and then begin my presentation. Himakis kaitiao inam himyuma inam lautuama inam hanyuat. It is a great honor. My Indian name derives from my grandmother. It's a great honor to be asked to speak in kind of this, I like how you say intersectionality of all of this white colonial settling of all of our indigenous lands. In the United States, if you can imagine, there are over 500 federally recognized tribes. There are more tribes than that. Some have only state recognition, and some have completely lost all recognition. Our tribe has been federally recognized since 1855. We also have a treaty with the United States of America, signed by the president at the time in 1855, once again in 1863. And then because those treaties were not honored, you then have the war against the Nez Perces in the War of 1877. And that was, when you think about history and how long our people have been on our lands, it was fairly recent. And I love the previous speaker, she mentioned, Alicia mentioned 200 years. When you think of indigenous people and indigenous culture, we have existed on our lands, and our history has told us for thousands and thousands of years peacefully, and the environment has been protected by our way of life, by our practices of living, by our oneness with the earth, and our belief, which are now called by white colonialism religious beliefs, even though they were only our way of life. Those practices kept the lifestyle and the health and wealth of our people continuing for thousands and thousands of years. And only in the last 200 years do you see the major destruction of not only our way of life, you see the crumbling of the environment, you see the common the common social and environmental justice issues that all Indigenous people are facing across the world. And those people were all facing a fight to hold on to our way of life, our natural resources, our language, all of those things that keep our identity, our identity. And what we were promised, what the Nez Perce people were promised in exchange for over 13 million acres of land, we were simply asking for us to have peace and to live our way of life. We were promised to have no white contact on our reservation without the expressed approval by our people, by our government. And the United States was acknowledging our government as a actual law-abiding government. And they allowed us, or we entered into a treaty and protected that right. So when common language today says we gave those Indians the rights, they didn't give us anything. We retained very few rights in what we were able to protect. And before the ink was even dry on the Treaty of 1855, the promises were already broken in that treaty. The United States already broke the promises, and that is because gold was found on our reservation, on the lands that they removed us from, 13 million acres. They found resources on the small lands they put us on, and then they allowed illegal white settlement on our reservation. This is where the danger really begins and the atrocities to our people really start to happen in terms of genocide, because then you have this widespread illegal contact and what we call squatting here in the United States on our lands, and widespread genocide of our people, killing and raping of our women, our men. Our way of life is becoming destructed. And the United States says we cannot protect you. Even though we have a treaty with them, we cannot protect you. And so what they do instead is they say, we will negotiate another treaty with you. And that became the Treaty of 1863, known to our people as the Steele Treaty. And when I say Steele, meaning steal, we call it the Steele Treaty because it is a way they stole our land from us again. And when I say that is because all of our, all the government that I mentioned, that they recognized our leadership, our chief system, and I have one chief right behind me, Chief Joseph. We had a chief for every band. So at that time, there were over 80 chiefs, and all of those chiefs would have had to have signed to make that treaty legal. That did not take place. And so that's why we call it the Steele Treaty. Most of our leaders, and the leaders I come from, I am a direct descendant from a Paswahite, commonly known as Old Chief Looking Glass. They all led our people on a plight to make it into Canada. And like many other Indian people, Indian tribes that were trying to escape the United States, we just wanted to live our way of life. We weren't asking for anything more than to continue our own way of life. And since that wasn't going to be honored, our new treaty was going to require us to all take an English name, to only speak English, to become a Christian, to take 40 acres and a mule and become farmers. Our old ways of living on our land would become no more. So we lived in certain areas of our land with the seasons. So where I presently reside in the state of Idaho, our state here where we live in a low valley. So the winters are really mild here historically. And so our people would set up winter camp here. And in the summer, it's very, very hot. So we would spend our summers in the Wallowa Mountains where it's beautiful and cool. And so we would travel with the seasons. Well, that way of life was going to be no more. And we were going to have to settle in one area, which is completely foreign to our way of existence. And so our people tried to flee into Canada, over 800 people, men, women, and children. And if it wasn't for the modern technology at the time, which was the telegraph, we would have actually made it into Canada and our existence would be up there today. Unfortunately, the military caught up with us in what is known today as Bears Paw, Montana, the state of Montana. And there's over 50 states in the United States, and all of them have their own, laws, and so to speak. But at the time, they caught us in Montana, only just less than 20 miles from the Canadian border. We had lost many women and children and people along the way that were killed and annihilated by the United States Cavalry. Those leaders, including the one behind me, Chief Joseph, were then taken to prisoners of war, and they were taken to Oklahoma, the state of Oklahoma, way across the United States, and taken to what was known as Indian prison territory. They call it Indian territory, but it was a prison camp. And that's why there's so many tribes that come from Oklahoma, is because a lot of tribes were displaced there. And if it wasn't until later in life that Joseph and our people were able to come back to the reservation. And after about 8 years of being in prison, our people were already settled here. The system of becoming advanced as people was easily figured out, so to speak, the power system. So people started to understand if you were a good Christian, then you would advance well. You would advance well with your white neighbors. And if you were still those troublemaking Indians, the people who wanted to speak our own language and live our own way of life and practice our own customs, you were considered a troublemaker. And so Joseph and all of our people were considered troublemakers, and they were sent to another reservation. And so our reservation today that still exists, that still has the boundaries here, but has a lot of white settlement. We live amongst, somebody mentioned, our host mentioned President Trump. We have a lot of President Trump supporters that live right around us, we live in a very rural area. And when we go to get our groceries or get our needs or go to the doctor, we're often met by people who do not care for our existence. We have a lot of racism in our state. We live around people who are very charged and ignited by former President Trump. A lot of people in this country have been ignited in racism now. You look at the work that Dr. Martin Luther King did, and many people did in the civil rights movement, including a lot of our leaders. It basically puts us all back to work, that all of our work now, we must work harder for social justice, social change in our country, including our tribes have really wrapped ourselves around the Black Lives Matter movement in this country as well. We have really worked hard to work with social justice with all people that are not getting social justice in the United States. Our existence today is very strange to even Americans, and because they are lazy, they don't understand the laws that their government created and their government entered into these treaties. We didn't ask for them. And when our neighbors say, our white neighbors say that they don't want our treaties anymore and they don't want us to have our special rights, our argument is then, well, give us our land back then, because we'll just go back to our way that we lived before for thousands and thousands of years in peace. And that is not something they're going to do. So they don't want us to have the very little that we have had to defend, just the very little we retained in our treaty. Our neighbors don't want us to have that. And there's always these groups, these legal groups popping up that are always trying to get the United States government to end the Nez Perce tribe, to end our existence. And they want us to just become Americans. I will tell you, our existence today is, I was listening to Alicia, and our existence is a double citizenship. We are a citizen within our own nation, the Nez Perce, or our ancestral name, or what we would say Aboriginal name, is Nimipu. The Nez Perce actually came from the white settlers, the United States, and the French fur traders came through exploring through the land, and they mistakenly thought we were people who pierced our noses, and so they called us the Nez Perce, and now it's known as the Nez Perce. And that was completely wrong, but that became our federal recognition. But our ancestral name, which we still go by, is Nimipu. And like all indigenous people across the world, our name simply means we are the people of this land. And when I have visited around the world and run into other indigenous people, that's what their ancestral name means, that they're the people of that particular land. And so we were one with the Creator, and one with our way of life was right in hand to guarantee the continuation of animals and the environment, and all lived in harmony. And now those the way of life is our way of life today is much more challenging. We have much more social problems than we would have ever known. Our people before white contact, the healthy relationships, the food systems, all of those things that we struggle with, disease, we struggle with diabetes because we no longer can get the food the way we did historically. So those are all things that have been greatly disturbed. And so a few years ago, when I started to read about the Palestinian struggle, I found myself saying that that's exactly what is going on with our people. And all they are asking for is for their own way of life and to be returned back to their own land. Now, that to me doesn't seem difficult. And I see a very similar structure that has been fought for, and that is this kind of dual laws or dual existence. And I think that can be good. And I think there also is this rightful mistrust, because that's exactly what the more powerful government has done to us. They have lied and not upheld any promise that they have made to our people or any tribe they've entered into a treaty with in the United States. The United States has not honored one treaty. And I'll end it with that. Thank you so much, and I look forward to any questions or comments. Thank you, Asala. Himak is kaitiao yocholo.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you for this insightful talk. And one thing that if there was one thing that will remain with me from that talk is how you said our name actually means that we are the people of this land. So that hit me really hard. Thank you very much. We will now go to our next speaker, Mark Muhannad Ayyash. Mark is the author of A Hermeneutics of Violence. He was born and raised in Silwan, Jerusalem, before immigrating to Canada, where he is now an associate professor of sociology at Mount Royal University. He's currently writing a book on settler colonial sovereignty in Palestine, Israel. Welcome, Mark Muhannad Ayyash.
Thank you so much, Asala. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the Palestinian Return Center for setting up this wonderful panel. And thanks to my fellow panelists as well. Fantastic talks by Rebecca and Alicia. Really honored and a pleasure to be on this. I'd like to first start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the homelands of the Niitsitapi, the Nakota, and the Tsuut'ina nations. And I would like to start with a very short quote from M.A. Césaire's famous book, Discourse on Colonialism, which was written some 7 years ago. Here goes. And he here is referencing basically colonialists, settler colonialists, and the sympathizers of colonialists who constantly throw in his face all of the achievements of colonialism. And here's the quote. They talk to me about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living. I am talking about societies drained of their essence, cultures trampled underfoot, institutions undermined, lands confiscated, religions smashed, magnificent artistic creations destroyed, extraordinary possibilities wiped out. They throw facts at my head, statistics, mileages of roads, canals, and railroad tracks. I am talking about millions of people torn from their gods, their land, their habits, their life, from the dance, from wisdom, end quote. And the reason that I start with that quote, other than its sheer beauty, of course, M.A. Césaire is a brilliant writer, is that it highlights that despite all of the differences between different settler colonial contexts, and there are certainly always differences in the legal regimes and the methods used and the people that were colonized, there are differences, but they all share one major similarity. Settler colonialism isn't only about constructions of settler colonial states. They are about the destruction of colonized societies. And as Alicia pointed out in her talk, you know, when she was referencing how Australia puts this image of this beautiful landscape and human rights and respect for democracy and so on and so forth, this is what you always hear from settler colonial states is how advanced and enlightened they are. But what is really at the foundation of all settler colonial states is violence and the brutal destruction of indigenous societies. And that brutal destruction isn't just about destroying people. It certainly does do that. It replaces the indigenous people of the land with settlers that come from elsewhere. That's certainly one of the big parts of it. But it also destroys and replaces indigenous forms of governance, indigenous laws, indigenous cultures, indigenous economies, indigenous social life. It destroys and replaces all of those, and it replaces them with settler colonial political, social, and economic and legal systems that are meant to maintain the power of the settler colonialists. They are not driven to improve the livelihoods or the lives of the indigenous people. All of those systems are driven towards one goal and one goal only: the continued elimination and replacement of indigenous people. And this is one of the key aspects of settler colonialism that you'll find across all of their differences in the different contexts, wherever you find them around the world. And it's the most amazing, really, part of settler colonialism is the resistance that you find against settler colonialism. Despite all of the efforts of settler colonial states to eliminate the indigenous people, they never succeed in doing that. And the reason they never succeed in doing that is because indigenous people resist. Indigenous people will always resist the effort to take them off their land, to destroy their complex social and political structures that they have lived under for centuries or decades, in some cases thousands of years. And I want to just say a little bit about that resistance from the Palestinian experience. Palestinian resistance has been around for over 100 years, and it has taken on an incredibly diverse array of actions. Everything from armed resistance to unarmed resistance. Of course, in the sort of Western, quote unquote, which is basically Western Europe and North American landscape, at least the non-indigenous aspects of the North American landscape, you only ever hear about armed Palestinian resistance. But in fact, unarmed Palestinian resistance makes up the majority of Palestinian resistance to their displacement. And the reason that you don't hear much about that is because settler colonial states are in kind of solidarity with each other. You know, this talk is about our solidarity as activists and as scholars and as indigenous people in resisting settler colonialism. But we have to also understand that settler colonial states themselves are strategically allied with each other. They see the world from a very similar standpoint. And so the reasons why in places like Canada, which is probably worse than the United States in terms of its coverage of the Palestinian struggle, media coverage, and by probably I mean it is worse. You only people here for the most part imagine Palestinian resistance as only armed resistance and as terroristic. But the fact of the matter, like I said, is that the majority of it is unarmed, and you know, the innovation and the sort of the ideas that Palestinians have come up with, and indigenous people that I've seen as well here in Canada and elsewhere, that have come up with to resist their elimination, to resist settler colonial power, have been quite extraordinary, nothing short of extraordinary. But you never really hear about it, and that's not happening by accident. That happens, you know, what enters public discourse on these issues is very much shaped by the power structures in which public discourse exists. So just to give you an idea of what I'm trying to refer to here, people, I find, often assume, good people, well-meaning people, good intentioned people, they often assume that they will hear about the next time a man stands up against a tank on Tiananmen Square. They just assume that image became popular, and then they know about it because the power of the image was too great for it to be kept hidden. But the fact of the matter is, I know of thousands of images, videos of Palestinians and other indigenous people resisting in similar way, even more powerful way, settler colonial violence. But that image never gets any play. It never gets any really serious discussion. In fact, not only have I seen images of that resemble that man standing in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square, I've seen images that, and I don't mean to be hurtful here or to re-traumatize anybody, but to just be upfront about the reality of the situation. I've seen cases where that tank runs over that man, and you still don't see anything about that. And that's the reality of settler colonial power structures in which we try to resist efforts to eliminate us. And when you start to think about the immense violence that settler colonialism brings on those who are destined for elimination and replacement, and you you start to think about their resistance and our resistance from within that worldview, you start to really get a sense, at least, of the extraordinary element of that resistance. Now, of course, I don't want to also just paint a picture of a heroic resistance that stands in the face of these power structures, regardless of the odds. I also want to underscore that the odds are really great against Indigenous people, and they have been for quite some time. And that's not a shortcoming of the resistance. That's not a shortcoming of those people. It's just the reality of the power differential between the settler colonists and the Indigenous people. And so there are many, many obstacles and many difficulties that come along with this resistance. Speaking on the Palestinian case, in my view, I think we're at a stage now where there is significant fragmentation of the Palestinian people. There's significant fragmentation between Palestinians in East Jerusalem versus those in the West Bank, versus those in Gaza, versus those in 48 Israel proper, versus those in the diaspora, versus those in the refugee camps, versus those who are internally displaced in internal refugee camps. The fragmentation, which was a product of a settler colonial set of policies and actions, has taken its toll on the Palestinian people and their resistance. And it's actually quite extraordinary that there's still solidarity among these groups, because they're experiencing very different forms of oppression, very different forms of elimination. So fragmentation is a key one. Another obstacle is fatigue. Indigenous people, like I said, have been struggling for, the Palestinian case, 100 years, but in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, on Turtle Island, it's been more than that, longer than that. And it's still going. And that's amazing to me. But we have to also acknowledge there's a level of fatigue a little bit sometimes that can set in. And that has to be overcome. And then finally, the other obstacle that I wanted to highlight is isolation. When you are fragmented in the way that Indigenous peoples have been fragmented, whether you're talking about, the brilliant examples that Rebecca brought up about, all those tribes and all those civilizations, let's call them what they were, that were forcefully placed in Indian prison countries. I love that. I'm going to include that. I'm used to Indian country, but Indian prison countries much more, or territories much more accurate, as Rebecca put it. That creates isolation from your lands, isolation from your culture, isolation from the systems under which that civilization grew and flourished. And these kinds of fragmentation that are faced by Indigenous peoples across the world do lead to a sense of isolation. And it's precisely to fight against this isolation specifically, but other things, but specifically isolation, that I find this kind of intersectional framework highly important. And these kinds of transnational solidarities incredibly important, because they offer the best cure to isolation. I find this a lot in talking to activists, reading activists, and reading scholarly activist work. There's whenever, I'll speak it from my own experience, whenever I feel entirely isolated, hopeless, this is not going anywhere, I'm going to live and die, and Palestinians will be under occupation. You even ask yourself, what's the point? And you get into these kinds of questions. Looking at other people's struggles really re-energizes you. And I found this a lot of Indigenous activists that I've met with Idle No More, who will find inspiration from the Palestinian cause. Meanwhile, a lot of those Palestinian activists are themselves finding inspiration from Idle No More. They're both keeping each other going without necessarily communicating that or even knowing about that. Black Lives Matter, as Rebecca mentioned, is another example. So these are really critical forms of solidarity for even just keeping morale up, for keeping hope up, for as Alicia also mentioned, try to look at it a crystal ball. Okay, if we don't do something about this is our future. Learning from our past as well, from our collective shared experiences. I think all of that is really critical aspect of transnational solidarity. And I'll just end it there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Muhannad, for touching on some great points and also referring to the power of resistance. So now it's time for Q&A. And one of the questions that it seems that one of our speakers has joined us. So we will go to our last, but of course not least speaker. Before we begin with our Q&A, we have Bruce Shillingsworth. Bruce is a Morawari and Gurjiti man, a talented artist and water for the rivers activist. His country is the northwest New South Wales riverlands that hug the Namoi, Barwon, Darling Rivers, Brewarrina, Burke, Ingonia, Wilcannia, and Walgett. Bruce's family are painters, dancers, and rainmakers. Bruce is a cultural educator in Sydney and leads a cultural revival dance group in the northwest. The northwest river communities have been devastated by water stealing by big cotton farmers and irrigators. Successive governments have failed to preserve the integrity of the rivers on which First Nations people depend for their life and livelihood. In October 2019, Bruce brought together communities along the river and Corroboree to unite people to solve this unprecedented crisis. Please welcome Uncle Bruce. Seems like we have technical difficulties. In that case, we'll go to the Q&A, and if Uncle Bruce joins us again, we'll make sure we will introduce Uncle Bruce. So we'll begin with our first question, and this question has been directed to Alicia. So if Alicia's still with us, awesome. So, Alicia, we have a question, and the question is, why do you think the prison population of Indigenous people is faster growing?
I did see this question, and I'm sure many of you listening to this question are probably thinking along the same line of thoughts as me. Again, with countries that are going through this form of colonization, and as I was mentioning earlier, a new type of a genocidal regime. Okay, guys, so we have to understand that what First Nations people in Australia is enduring, it's not looking like what it did when the British initially arrived. But ironically, prisons and the increasing prison rate and over-policing in this country is something that has happened over the last 200 and something years. Now, the reason why Indigenous people, or we refer to ourselves as blackfellas or black, the reason why black people in this country are being incarcerated at higher rates than our non-Indigenous counterparts is simply racial, discriminatory, a legal system, to the police, to magistrates, to the entire legal system. This is affecting our capacity to even reach bail. This is affecting our capacity to get good behavior bonds. Now, this has been statistically proven throughout states in this entire country that the same crimes committed by non-Indigenous people, they are attributed the opportunity, like I mentioned, to bail out or to get good behavior bonds or to walk free. But the Indigenous counterparts are hit with the heavier penalty. And again, guys, we also have to understand in the colonial welfare state, Indigenous people are constantly under the supervision of the welfare state. We are highly policed, highly highly, the government is deeply embedded in our communities. We have no sense of security and or privacy. So under, the panopticon that is our government, and a lens that is so heavily critical on such a demographic of people, you're going to have disproportionate statistics in relation to prison and incarceration. But I'd also like to say, in Australia, again, with the lack of economic stability and provisions and access for First Nations people, we are unable to access lawyers. We are unable to access sufficient legal representation. There are also many First Nations people in this country, my father being one, whose first language is not English. So there are great cultural limitations in communication styles. It's very, very different to that of the West, but also you're dealing with people that have the most basic numeracy and literacy rates. So I'm talking people that don't even have a kindergarten equivalent education, and people that don't have identification. So people that don't have passports, people that don't have birth certificates, don't have any form of identification, and most importantly, cannot read or write. And that is contributing to First Nations people being incarcerated in Australia.
We have a question that's to all of our speakers. And the question is there a connection between America, Israel, and Australia, as they're all settler colonies? So to anyone who would like to answer this question, please feel free to come forward.
Can I?
Oh, we have Bruce, Uncle Bruce. You're with us.
Good. Can I answer your question?
Yes, of course.
Well, look, if we look at all the countries we talk about, we've still got the old colonial rule. There's still the old terrorism and the genocide and all that stuff still happening and still controlling, especially First Nation lives. And I think, especially First Nation people here in Australia, their voices have been silent. So I think it's time that we come together in solidarity and start talking about the issue that affects our lives through colonialism and through the stuff that systematic discrimination, the Institute, all those stuff that are set up to affect our lives and to stop the progress of our people.
I might go to Mark also. What do you think connects Israel, Australia, and America?
They are all rooted in European settler colonial worldview, and colonial and settler colonial worldview. They are all projects that stem from a specific European history that started in the 15th century, and it has a numerous features. Of course, one of them is the thinking of race and the ideology of race and racism, and in my view, they also all share a view of land that is quite different from Indigenous conceptions of land. In a lot of Indigenous communities, and that includes communities across the world, I would argue, the view of land is not a utilitarian one. It's not land as property. It's land as life. Life and land are not separated, and all three are settler colonies that operate on the logic that land is there to be owned. You practice a kind of lordship over it. That notion of lordship is not really present in a lot of Indigenous forms of connecting to the land. So I think that they are related in their fundamentals, and that has grown over the years. And people, you can talk about economic, strategic alliances, and all of these other aspects are important too. But to me, that's the foundation that they all share.
Yep. There's another question that we have, which is, why do Indigenous people or peoples tend to care more for the environment and climate than the governments and leadership of settler colonial states? Why is the environment so important to us? Why is the land so important to us?
Well, my belief is almost an extension of what Mark just said in the different ideology of land ownership. What we call Western European ideology is that it is owned, that I can own and do with it what I please. And the way that we lived in one with nature is that we were a part of it. We were a part of land. We were just a piece of it and we had a responsibility. And in our history, and in our culture, we believe that the animal people came before us and the earth came before us, and that we were put on this land after, and that we had a responsibility. We have all of our storytelling tells us that. It's all considered folklore to Western Europeans and the way we think today, but it is no different than the history that people live by today. It's our history. And so Indigenous people, when you talk about taking people from their land, that idea is just like taking you from your family or your child or your identity. You can't do that. And so that's why there's so much resistance, because you're in one with that entire system. And the ideology that you do not own it, but you are responsible for its care, is really, really powerful. And I think that is where it really returned, like our existence is, many times our chiefs would come back from buffalo country from hunting, and there would be fences put up on property that they were used to passing, and they would think, what is this? What is this fence? What is this structure that I cannot pass through here and be free? And to see the practices of farming was just so, it was like destroying our mother, because we considered Earth our mother Earth. And if you weren't careful in how you took food from mother, then it wouldn't come back to you. And so these harsh farming practices were just completely like, you are asking our people to annihilate our mother. And so I think that is a lot of the comparison and the deep contrast you see between the two. And I'll let other folks answer as well.
Alicia, do you want to talk, or do you want me to speak first?
You go first.
Okay. Look, the greater connection to our Mother Earth, goes back to the beginning of time. Our connection to the land and where we live, evident through our Dreamtime stories. Our DNA lies in Mother Earth. Our spirits, our soul, our everything relies on Mother Earth, because to sustain us for so many years. Non-Indigenous people, Western world now, are put, a dollar sign. They're nearly everything's becoming they're selling it for money. But what one of our beliefs is our totem system. If my totem was the emu, I weren't allowed to kill the emu or eat the emu. My sole responsibility was to protect that animal so it doesn't become extinct. So right across this big nation here of Australia, 500 plus nations, we had a responsibility of taking care of every living creature, every living thing that's on the land. And if that dies or disappears or become extinct, it become our responsibility. So over the last 250 years, whose responsibility has it become? When we look around, we see our land's been, the land's been raped. Our animals are now becoming extinct. Australia's got the record of the most extinct animals in the world. The animals that lives in the great circle of life, that keeps things alive, that keeps us alive. Water, which is life, our natural resources, are a part of us. It's our DNA. So our story goes back to the first sunrise. Our totem system, our songline, our dances, our music goes back to the great journey to the beginning. And when we talk about the dream time here, we talk about the past, the present, and the future. So we've got to take care of Mother Earth that sustains us, that keeps us alive. It gives us our medicinal use. It keeps us healthy. Over the last 200 years, we see the health problems in our people, the drying up of our rivers, the destruction of the land, the poisoning of their waterways, the poisoning, the toxin in our foods, the hair is becoming polluted. That's what we're up against. But our connection will always be our connection to the part of the land in which we belong, because that's where our ancestors have been for thousands and thousands of years.
Is there someone else that would like to address this question before we move to another question? Okay. So we have a question here, which is, how can we make sure there is greater awareness of global colonialism?
What was the question again?
So the question is, how can we make sure there is greater awareness of global colonialism? So, sometimes in different countries, people might think they are the victims of colonization, and they're unaware that there are actually other people who are indigenous in different parts of the world who are going through similar experiences. So in what ways can we raise awareness of the similar experiences and connect with the indigenous people wherever they are?
I guess I'll contribute to that one. So I'm working really hard on my social media. If anyone is interested, my Instagram is 8983AJ. So I've tapped into Instagram, but also good old TikTok. I don't know if any of you guys know what that bloody app is, but some days I just feel like deleting it entirely. But I use that app to talk about issues that Indigenous people are navigating. If it's a 60-second video of me walking through some red dirt, or if it's a 60-second video talking about a discrimination I experienced in a shopping center, by using social media consistently and regularly, by pushing through the racial degradation and abuse that I receive online daily, the threats, the violence, by pushing through that, I believe I've been able to tap in and reach the broader Australian diaspora. But in saying that, even though once I'm in the mind frame or the accessible by white Australia, I'm still held to these upward standards of, idealization of what a Black woman should be or what I can and can't say. So in saying that, I think if we are going to look at ways to access and share information about our lived experience, and also paying homage and respect to what other First Nation or Indigenous people are experiencing globally, I just want to make sure that I'm not contributing to putting them to, idolization, or putting them on unrealistic understandings of their identity, if that makes sense. Because I did note that with through social media, you are getting a lens, or you're getting a filter of identities. So just constantly being critical, engaging consistently, and making sure that we're listening to Indigenous voices, not on the top of the hierarchy, or not the ones that are promoted, but make sure we're listening to the voices in community.
And I think, Alicia, it's about us coming together. I mean, look, I'm doing a lot of stuff around the water, but our leaders in this country seem to not listening. So I think we've got to go global, connecting up with our brothers and sisters from other parts of the world, building that strength. We got the platform now to be able to get our voices out there, the voices that have been silent for so many years. And I think, look, we got the platform. Let's strengthen that. Let's keep coming together. Let's keep having these talks. Let's empower our communities, get our communities together. Look, we need to unite. It's the only way forward. We've got to unite. And I think it's about, we go back, we talk about respecting people's background, all that sort of stuff as well. But I think it's building and passing on that knowledge and all the information to our younger ones. I think we need better leaders out there. So let's get the young ones involved. Let's get more of our community involved. So, I believe the power is in the people. And once we're united, they don't want to see us united, but once we do unite, we can start to make changes. We can make difference in our lives and across the country.
If I would just add quickly, I agree with both Bruce and Alicia on this, and I'll add to this education as well. And we need to act in a way where we understand that the existing structures in a lot of the places where we live don't want this. So we have to force it on them. When we're trying to get into decolonize our curriculum, we have to, I support that, but let's understand they're not going to help us do it. What they want to do is decolonize in safe ways. So when we talk about decolonize the curriculum or education, we have to do it in a way where we understand that this is a battle. This is not, we don't have too many allies in the power structures. So we have to force them to do it. And we do that through some of the actions that Bruce and Alicia are talking about, reaching out to people, activism, activists uniting, creating solidarities. We've seen in world history anti-colonial struggles that spanned entire continents. So this can be done. And there are tools that can maybe enable that, like social media and what have you. We have to be careful as well. That's not my strength, social media or anything like that. But we have to understand that as well. States can do surveillance over social media and all of that. So it's always a double-edged sword. But there are historical examples of anti-colonial struggles coming together. Why not now?
For our last question, it's been directed to Rebecca. Rebecca, do you feel that the new US President Biden will aid or hinder Indigenous people's rights?
Thank you, Asala, for the question, and whoever asked that. We strongly believe President Biden will support. Actually, on his first day of executive orders, one of his executive orders was to honor the treaties with the nations that exist, they already are in place. So he already put in place to honor the indigenous rights of tribes. He put into already the head of Department of Interior. He named the first ever an American Indian, Deborah Holland, who serves in Congress presently, but he has named her as his Secretary of Interior, which is over all lands in the United States, and that's with great opposition from the far right side, because they know exactly when President Trump was in power, he actually put people who knew nothing about the actual subject of these various departments, but they knew property values, they knew resource values, and so there was a reason they were there, and that was to pillage and take everything possible. And for example, one of the things that was in litigation for years and years under the Trump administration was the Alaska Arctic Refuge, and President Biden immediately stopped that on his first day in office. And so those are all areas where Indigenous people are winning over and over. I think that's wonderful what's happening. It's like a breath of fresh air, what is happening. But Trumpism is not over. It's been ignited so much in this country that racism used to be hidden, and when it happened, people would say, oh, it doesn't exist anymore. Now people are very proud to be racist again, that it's a proud place to be, and it's a very dangerous place to be. And as Indigenous people, we have the burden of educating people about our way of life, and we have the burden of protecting our way of life, which means protecting the environment that is a benefit for everybody. And then we also have to live our own lives, which is different than our counterparts. Americans just go on their life and consume, and they don't think anything about contributing to society in a way that will benefit future generations, or make sure the seventh generation has the resources to live as we do, or as our ancestors lived. And that is a very dangerous place to be when the resources are already scarce. And when the resources are scarce, that's when the fighting becomes more and more detrimental to Indigenous people, because we lack the power system. And just to answer part of the last question, we're working really hard in education, from Bruce said, from the young ones. We're working on bills in different states here in Idaho to make sure that we can teach Indigenous history in the public school system, because that is a way of teaching early on. Because Mark mentioned it. I mean, power structures today don't want it. They don't care. They don't care to learn a different way of living. They're just comfortable in their own privilege, and they don't care who else doesn't have it. And so I thank you so much, Asala, and thank you very much for the question, and thank you for this wonderful panel.
Before I reintroduce Uncle Bruce, I actually have a question to all speakers, which is, since colonization has lasted for over years, what keeps you motivated to stand against colonization?
For me, it's injustice. Injustice will always generate resistance. Injustice will never go unanswered. Even if it is by just a small number of people, it will be resisted. So it is what I kind of mentioned in my talk. What keeps me going is seeing that resistance across the world in other people. It's not just in the Palestinian resistance that I find inspiration, or in the Palestinian case that I find inspiration. I'll find it in other places. Wherever there is injustice, there's inspiration to keep fighting and fighting for justice.
Can I
real quick?
Okay. Can I say, look, what keeps us going is that, we're still the sovereign owners of the land. Why do we want to give up our land where our people have lived for thousands and thousands of years? Our environment, we've seen the destructions and the devastation. That's why I fight to heal Mother Earth and to heal us as First Nation on our own sovereign lands.
Rebecca, did you want to contribute to that?
I was just going to say, keeping motivated. I agree with Mark in terms of injustice, and we see we see it daily, an injustice happening to somebody, either us or somebody in our family or somebody close to us, or a sister tribe in another state. But the other thing is duty and culture is a responsibility to our future generations. And we were always taught by our our leaders and our elders is that we have a responsibility. We can't live for ourselves today. All of our decisions need to impact 7 generations down. So what are the decisions we make today, and how does that impact our future generations? And so with New Life, that gives us energy. And I agree with Mark. You hit that fatigue of saying the same thing over and over and fighting these battles that sometimes seem take years and years. And yet you find within yourself those various examples of motivation I mentioned. So thank you so much.
Oh, and I guess what keeps me going is just the notion that as a First Nations woman of Australia and as a mum, as I mentioned, as a 4-year-old, it's really evoked something in me, you know, to fight harder than what I ever have. You know, just looking at my daughter growing up in this, you know, 21st century and particularly 2021, you know, it's out of necessity. You know, if Indigenous women across the board, if we are silent, if we do not, you know, continue our culture, if we do not put the fire in our children's bellies, it's gonna go out, and unfortunately that is what the end goal is of this colonial welfare state. So as hard as it gets, as I said, online, irregardless, in real life, on the street, wherever it may be, I know that I have to continue with this fight, and it's nice to know that I'm fighting the good one.
Thank you all for contributing to the questions. I would like to now reintroduce Uncle Bruce to proceed with his talk.
Yeah, look, I think we live in a great time in history. I mean, we're all here, and I believe that we've been guided by our ancestors. Our ancestors are with us today. The spirit of the land is now starting to speak. The spirit of the land is not only touching the hearts of Indigenous people, it's touching the hearts of non-Indigenous people. Our journey, we're on the journey now. The journey is not about any individual. It's not about any particular group. It's about all of us. And I think it's about our survival as humans on this one planet. We live on one planet. There's no plan B. We can't go nowhere else, so we need to look after and take care of Mother Earth. So I believe that we are now become the protectors, the knowledge holders, the storytellers for our old people. The baton has now been passed to us. We stand in the gap to save another seven generation of our children and their children's children. That's what keeps me going, always concerned about our children. But I believe that when we start on our journey, I believe that we'll get to our destiny. By doing that, we need to unite as First Nation people, bring about our dialogues and conversations about the common things that we have. But the things that are happening in the world today affects all of us. Mother Earth is so important. It sustains us, feeds us, gives us all we need. So we're going to take care of Mother Earth. So we are now in a time in history, like I said, we're now riding the winds of change. We're riding the waves of change. Change is going to come. People, we're a grassroots movement. And I believe that the grassroots people are going to make a difference. We live in our communities. We know our communities. We know what our communities want. Our old people have been saying these things for a long, long time now. It's time that we take reign, we take the baton and be responsible and start doing the things for our children. And I think because we're sovereign nations, we need to go back to our practices and our tradition and our culture and the knowledge. That's where our answer is. Our DNA lies. Our DNA lies in our history and where we're from. The connection to the land is so important. We cannot break that connection. The land is who we are. And I think it's so important that we keep teaching those things, through education, coming together, having our ceremonies, having our celebrations. but also empowering our brothers and sisters, not just here in Australia, but across the world. I think First Nation people have a message, and they've got a very important message. I believe that we should be in the forefront, in the front line of all the decision making around our land and our environment. And I believe it's got to happen. People, we've got to realise now that the stars are now lining up. The Spirit has now called us. You're not here because you want to be here. The Spirits have now called us to be here in this time. It is time. It is our time.
Thank you very much, Uncle Bruce. It is time and it is our time. Thank you. This comes to the end of today's event. I just want to say thank you to our audience, and I would also like to remind you to please sign the My Return campaign at myreturn.net and to tune into the PRC's next event on Thursday, 18th of February here on Facebook Live and YouTube, entitled Reporting on Palestine Behind the Headlines, where we will be speaking to 4 Palestinian journalists on Palestine's biggest headlines in 2020 and 2021 so far. The headlines that didn't garner as much attention as they should have, and the challenges Palestinian journalists face. Once again, I would like to thank our audience and our amazing speakers. Power to all Indigenous people wherever they are in this world. I would also like to personally acknowledge my people back home in Palestine. I hope you have a good morning or a good evening or a good night or even a good afternoon wherever you are in this world. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yıllar geçse de, ömrüm bitse de, beni öldürse de, döneceğim, bekle Filistin. لو مرت أعوام، لو صلبت أحلام، لو كسرت أقلام، حتما ستعود فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري، وكذاك طريق الأحرار. في جيبي مفتاح الدار، سأعود لأرض فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري، وكذاك طريق الأحرار. في جيبي مفتاح الدار، سأعود لأرض فلسطين. Seni unutup gitmem, sensiz hiç olmam. Sevdim, sever seveceğim, döneceğim, bekle Filistin. لو طال الأسر، لو محيا الفجر، لو نفد الصبر، حتما ستعود فلسطين. العودة حقي وقراري، وكذاك طريق